SEP Readings presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 33. Watching You. Hermione twirled around the floor, her train swept up onto her wrist, and thanks to magic weighing next to nothing. Even with the cushioning charms on her ballet slippers, her feet were sore, but she was having such a good time she didn't even care. She threw her head back laughing as Draco spun her, lifting her up so that he could kiss her before he handed her off to George Weasley, who proceeded to twirl her so much she got dizzy. She was saved by Arthur Weasley, who very kindly kept the dance to a slow waltz. She could see Draco out of the corner of her eye, dancing with Molly Weasley, who looked lovely in a silver dress robes that had to be new. Arthur, following her line of sight, smiled. "She looks stunning, my Molly." Hermione nodded. "The robes look lovely on her." Arthur nodded, flushing a bit. Narcissa Malfoy showed with Kingsley, of all people. He escorted her, as she still is under house arrest, and allowed her to come drag Molly with her to go shopping. Molly came home with an entirely new wardrobe. Narcissa said it was her way of saying thank you for killing Bellatrix so that she didn't have to kill her own sister. Molly was crying as they sat there having tea. Arthur got thoughtful before he smiled. "She's a good witch, Narcissa Malfoy. Her and Molly now meet for tea once a week." Hermione was stunned and felt a tear gather before it fell down her cheek. "Oh, I'm so happy to hear this, Arthur. I worried so much, given how your families have never got on." Arthur smiled. "You're as much our daughter as Ginny is. I think Narcissa realized that, and she showed up wanting to make sure that there were good relations between us. We recognized the olive branch and accepted it. Very decent of Kingsley to let her do so. I understand she wrote him herself." Hermione hugged the old wizard, sniffling a bit, but smiling with such happiness that a few wizards stopped to stare at the beautiful witch. When it was time for the next dance, Hermione politely refused and rushed towards Ginny, who was sitting on Blaise Zabini's lap, looking happy but tired. "My feet may never recover," Hermione said, kicking off her shoes and putting them on Ginny's lap. Ginny laughed and started rubbing her friend's feet, her face teasing. "Imagine the state they would be in if Pansy had gotten her way on the heels." Hermione groaned and then grinned, looking around for her brother and his fiancée, finding them snogging in a corner. Ginny looked over and snickered. "Those two will probably bump up the wedding. They can't keep their hands off each other." Blaise wrapped his arm around his fiancée's waist and nibbled at her neck. "I find that I too wish to move up our wedding." Ginny chuckled and turned to kiss him. "If you can convince my mother, by all means, let's move the date." Hermione snickered as she watched Blaise pale, and then nodded in resignation. "We shall wait." Ginny winked at Hermione, and then laughed as Hermione groaned in pleasure at her foot rub. "Hey, any sounds like that out of my wife should be because of me," was said in annoyance by Draco, who had just shown up. Ginny laughed and moved Hermione's feet onto her new husband's lap. "All yours then, Draco." Draco grinned and dug his thumbs into her instep, causing her to moan in pleasure. "That's more like it," he said with a leer. Everyone chuckled and Hermione wiggled her toes. "We have cut the cake, danced with everyone here, and heard the totally inappropriate speeches from our friends. What is left before we can leave, Draco?" The blonde wizard shrugged. "I have no idea. My mother planned this elaborate party." Hermione looked around the huge ballroom and sighed with happiness. It was stunningly beautiful. Huge chandeliers lighted the space. The ballroom floor was polished black and white marble. A refreshment table with desserts and nuts and berries took up one wall, with a bar taking up the other. There were doors that led out into the garden, where the wisteria theme had continued, and around the room in each corner the woven bunches of Scottish wildflowers could be found. The tables were off to the far left-hand side of the ballroom, which simply had to have been magically expanded, and dressed in beautiful purple tablecloths with plush velvet chairs of the same color. The silverware and plates had flower patterns on them, and Hermione secretly wanted to lay claim to them. When she had mentioned this to Draco, he had kissed her nose and promised that he would make sure to get the pattern from his mother and gift them to her. They had requested not to have a head table, but rather sit at one of the circular tables with their guests. Hermione, and especially Draco, had decided being on display during the reception was not how they wanted to spend their first supper as man and wife. The champagne, which was a huge hit, as well as wine, were both flowing from the golden fountains in corners of the room, something that had charmed the guests. Hermione, however, had not indulged in either spirit, because she knew she was going to be tired and she wanted to remember this night, every detail for her entire life. Draco continued to massage her sore feet, his hands moving up her legs just enough to tease her before he returned her foot, looking totally innocent. Eventually, however, Hermione was starting to heat up with the sexual tension, and she used her toes and the dress that was draped over his lap to tease his semi-hard manhood. That lasted for 3 minutes exactly, before he put her shoes back on and stood her up. "All right, Mrs. Malfoy. We are finding my mother and making our escape before I ravish you right here in this ballroom in front of all of our guests." Hermione chuckled. "And 5 reporters from Wizarding Publications." Draco grimaced and twirled her into a waltz so that they could get past well-wishers faster. "Bloody reporters," he grumbled into her neck, kissing his way up to her ear and causing her to shiver. She moaned and pressed closer to him, her hand sliding into his hair and pulling his lips to hers for a deep and totally inappropriate snog in the middle of the ballroom. Draco groaned as the whistling and heckling finally pulled them apart. "Right, find my mother, escape, and you naked." Hermione giggled and allowed him to drag her over to where Narcissa was sitting with a group of older witches. "Mother, it's been a simply lovely party, but I think it's time we say our goodbyes." Narcissa, whose eyes were twinkling at her son, nodded and stood up. "Come on, then. There will be an announcement and then fireworks, after which you will depart." Draco let out a quiet sigh, while Hermione swayed a bit. She really was rather exhausted all of a sudden. A half-hour later, wrapped in her husband's arms, she watched the amazing firework display, compliments of the Weasleys' joke shop, and had to hide her yawn. "Tired?" was whispered into her ear, with a soft bite to her earlobe. Hermione shivered in desire, and then yawned, laughing. "Exhausted. How about you?" Draco sighed and rubbed circles just under her breasts. "Will you think less of me if I take a pucker-up potion so that I can make love with you tonight?" Hermione giggled and turned his arms to kiss him, nibbling on his lower lip. "Only if you share." He grunted and swept her up against his body to give her a hungry kiss before he pulled away, gasping for breath. "Bloody hell, I want you." "You have me," Hermione said, kissing his jaw down his neck. Draco pulled her into his side, walking them back since the fireworks had ended. "Not yet. Malfoy bonds require us to seal them in bed, dear wife." Hermione gasped. "What? How old-fashioned!" Draco shrugged. "How wonderful. I can think of no better way to seal a bond, personally." Hermione rolled her eyes and hit him on the arm playfully. "Get us to bed, then, before I fall asleep on you. It's almost 2 a.m. It took an hour to bid farewell to guests who seemed willing to party until dawn. They left, still in their wedding garb, running through a shower of wand sparks and laughing guests, almost all rather tipsy. Draco led her to the apparition point, and anchoring her to him, he kissed her and apparated them away. Hermione looked around curiously and shivered. "A field?" Draco took off his outer robes and draped them around her shoulders as he picked up an old can, tapping it with his wand. "Just our portkey, love." She allowed him to pull her back into his side as they were whisked away by the portkey to a destination that left her shocked. "Draco!" He leaned down and kissed her, his face worried. "We have to be inside the wards of the manor for the bond to take place. Please just trust me. You know I wouldn't be here without good reason." Hermione looked at the large, imposing manor, and then nodded, taking his hand and allowing him to pull her into him and apparate them in. She felt as if the wards caressed them as they both moved through, and when she opened her eyes it was to gasp in stunning surprise at what she was seeing and feeling. "Draco!" He gave her a soft smile. "Every Malfoy bride since the manor was built has spent their wedding night in this room, Hermione. Can you feel the magic here?" Hermione nodded, goosebumps showing up on her arms. "Yes. What is it?" Draco's smile widened. "Sex magic. Most brides are virgins and terrified. Some had only met their husbands that day. This room is one huge lust potion. I wandered into it once as a teen, and let me tell you, it packs a punch." Hermione had to giggle at that as she looked around at the soft white room with a large bed in the middle, made up in lush linens and also white. On the walls were old gas lamps that had been set on low, and cheerful fire burned in the grate. She did a turn and saw that there was a large, old-fashioned bathtub in the corner by the fire, big enough for two, and thick towels. By the bed there was refreshments, and cheese, bread, and fruit. But when you looked closely, you could see the runes all around the base of the room, etched into the stone. She translated enough to realize that there was nothing harmful about the room. It was simply a room meant to enhance desire, love, and lust. "I feel invigorated," she said, suddenly realizing her earlier fatigue was gone. Draco nodded as he stripped off his vest and took off his cufflinks. "As do I. I suppose we won't need to call for a pucker-up potion after all." Hermione nodded and watched her new husband pull off his button-down white shirt, and then start on his trousers. "I can't get out of this dress without help," she said, softly mesmerized by his white chest. He nodded, his eyes hooded and full of desire. "I have no problem helping you divest yourself of that lovely dress." Hermione sighed and bit her lip, looking at the bed. "It skeeves me out a little, knowing your parents had their wedding night in that bed, Draco Malfoy." There was a grunt, and then she heard him laughing. "It's tradition, but thanks for that mental picture, Hermione Malfoy." She grinned and turned around as she felt him walk to her, showing him the line of buttons down her back and smiling at his hiss of annoyance. "I can't just rip it off you." Hermione snorted. "It's a Muggle tradition to save your wedding dress." "Bloody hell," he said softly, setting to work on the buttons one at a time. Soon Hermione was shifting, because with each bit of skin he revealed, he laid a tender kiss upon her back. Once the bodice fell, she had to hold it up so that he could finish, and then she simply let the dress pool at her feet. She let out a small moan as he worked on her garter belt and silk stockings, rolling them down and off her legs, and then she was left in just her silk knickers. Draco looked at the stunning witch in front of him, and thanked every god he could think of that she was his, although not totally. He ran his hands up her thighs and then slowly peeled the bit of silk off her body, smiling as her arousal washed over him. Good. She was just as affected as he was. It was a heady feeling, tasting her now, realizing he could do this the rest of his life and no one could stop him. There was no worry that her damn brother would be banging on the door. No rush because they had to hurry before they were missed. Sure, he might miss the intrigue of arranging to turn one of the classrooms into a love nest for the night, but he enjoyed the knowledge that she was his, and he was hers, and they could do this as much as they wanted from this moment on and owed no one an explanation. "Love me," she whispered brokenly. Draco dropped his forehead to hers and took in ragged breaths. "Oh, baby, I will always love you," he answered, kissing her deeply, and then throwing his head back as he felt her clenching around him. He wasn't going to last. He was so lost to her. Merlin, the feeling was so fantastic he could get addicted to it. No wonder you were only allowed in this room one night. He could happily stay here and starve to death just making love to his wife. Hermione was panting under him, covered in sweat and blinking at him dazedly. "Oh, Draco, that was... what on earth was that?" He let out a weary chuckle and slowly pulled out of her, and got up, pulling her up with him to head over to the tub that he knew would hold hot water to soothe her aching muscles. "I think that was a combination of the room and our bond, love." Hermione gave a tired nod and allowed him to pull her into the tub after him, resting her head on his shoulder, as he piled all the curls on her head, using his own wand to keep them up. "Draco, the room went gold just like when Kingsley said our bond vows. That's not normal, right?" Draco dropped a kiss on her shoulder and sighed heavily. "No, it's not. It only happens with true soul bonds, and I would imagine no one there had ever seen that before. The room is the completion of our vows, so it's not surprising the magic here glowed gold as well." He felt her hand rubbing over his rune. "Our runes?" He grunted and ran his finger over hers. "Are itching again." She gave a small chuckle. "Yes, I was really worried that meant we were conceiving a child, but so far that hasn't been the case." Draco went still, and then kissed the top of her forehead. "Baby, I know you were on the potion, but I won't even bother with the contraceptive spell anymore. Everything I have read about being soul-bonded tells me that it's absolutely not up to us." Hermione frowned and shifted to look at him. "Are you asking me to go off my potion?" Draco considered this and then shook his head. "No, because even if you do fall pregnant, it isn't harmful. But will you do me a favor and just assume it could happen and start taking vitamins for me? I know how you forget to eat when you are busy, and masteries are pretty intensive." Expecting a fight, Draco was surprised when she smiled sweetly and kissed him tenderly. "Of course, that makes good sense. I'm not ready to give up hope that I can somehow control my destiny, and although I wouldn't mind if we had a baby this young, I would rather wait." Draco smiled and kissed her again. "I guess we will see. My father seems to think that the magic of our bond will not give us a child until we are both ready." Hermione considered this and then shrugged. "Well, as much as it pains me to say this, I hope your father is correct." Draco threw back his head laughing and grabbed the soap with a yawn. He was growing tired quickly and wanted the pleasure of washing her up before he carried her back to their marriage bed. By the time they made it back to the bed, both were utterly exhausted and asleep within minutes. They missed the room glowing gold as they slept, the room reaching to their magical bond and absorbing some of it. Later they would learn that each couple left an impression in the room that made it stronger or weaker for the couple that came next after them. When their firstborn son took his bride to the room, their wedding night would be one for the books, all thanks to his parents' deep soul bond. In fact, generations to come would benefit from the magic the room had absorbed the night Draco took Hermione Granger as his bride.